Aloha, can everyone hear me? Okay, we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel, which is titled Green, Blue, and Equitable, highlighting and scaling U.S. states' best practices for increasing resilience. So we have quite a remarkable lineup here for you. There are double the number here, so you'll be actually seeing double. We have some participants on Zoom that you should be able to see on the screen. There are 4 of us here and 4 on the ground back at home in the United States. And we'll be going through them sort of alternating to talk about this, this issue. So my name is Anu Hittel, and I work for the state government of Hawaii. I am the Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Coordinator. And we are really trying to bring here, as part of the US Climate Alliance that we are all part of, members of, our states are members of. We're trying to bring you here what we usually say, we talk about in our bi-weekly work calls. So this is really sort of a working session for you in a way, and for us. We're hoping to get some ideas from all of us, the 4 here and well, mostly from these 3, not so much from me, the 3 of us, the 3 of you guys, and the 4 back at home. And what I'd like to do is just lay a little bit of context for our panel, and I should say for our work stream here. So we've been trying to figure out how all of what's going on with COP26, the high ambition, the high level conversations we've had, what does that mean when it's translated to work on the ground for us? Our nitty gritty, we all work in state government. There are a lot of things that, trip us up, that we trip ourselves up, we trip each other up. We're trying to figure out how do we move forward with all these high ambitions that our states have set. There are so many new commitments. So what I've asked my colleagues to do here today is to tell us how they've rolled out, how they plan to roll out the next steps in the next maybe 6 to 12 months, taking one example, maybe one that's even in the resilience, the governor's resilience playbook that the US Climate Alliance has just released. And we'll go from there and figure out which part of those, 12 steps, some of them are case studies. I would encourage you to look at those 12 steps to set and achieve an effective state level climate agenda. So with that, I'm going to start. I'll go absolutely last if there is time to actually say a little bit about what Hawaii is doing, but I would like to start with my colleague here, Ben Grumbles, who is, Ben, I have so many papers to shuffle here. Let me actually get your title down properly so that I can stop teasing you. So I can stop teasing you and actually be respectful now that everyone's got their eyes on us, right? No one will believe me. All right, well then I'm going to just put it over to Ben from Maryland.
Thank you, Anu. Yes, I'm Ben Grumbles. I'm the Secretary of the Environment for the state, for Governor Larry Hogan and the citizens of Maryland. And Anu, I know Hawaii is doing a tremendous amount on adaptation and resilience. So kudos to you and to all the panel members. The states are united in increasing and strengthening our preparedness and resiliency. So the U.S. Climate Alliance, all of the states are very focused on that. And it's worth it to shine the spotlight at COP26 on the importance of not only reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also increasing resiliency and preparedness. And so often for us in Maryland, we live for those moments where you can do both at the same time. So in Maryland, which is dominated by water, over 90% of the state is in the Chesapeake Bay, the nation's largest estuary, the drainage area. And over 70% of the population of Maryland lives near the coast. We're very focused on coastal resiliency and climate resiliency inland. Our state has developed a climate resiliency and adaptation framework, which is a blueprint for actions in the water, land, built environment, urban and rural sectors to increase our preparedness. I can give you very quickly a few highlights. Maryland is unique in that it has realized that climate change is water change. Our stormwater pollution permitting program requires urbanized areas during the course of those stormwater pollution permits, 5-year permits, to continuously reduce the amount of impervious surface area. The reason is it's not just about improving the quality of that stormwater, it's also about managing the quantities, reducing flooding. It's about slowing it down, spreading it out, soaking it in, and using nature-based solutions. Our state has signed on to the 1 trillion tree pledge. We're committed to growing and maintaining up to 7 million trees, planting those trees over the next several years. And we're focused on wetlands and blue carbon, which is a great example of those twofer opportunities where you are with coastal wetlands and marshland, of which Maryland has a lot. We not only can sequester the carbon to get it out of the atmosphere, but we're also providing a buffer for flooding and an important habitat for our precious natural resources. Maryland has not only developed a framework that includes specific programs like the stormwater pollution prevention, green infrastructure initiatives, but also our state has a Coast Smart program where we're focused on providing incentives and restricting growth. It's spun out of the smart growth movement to focus specifically on critical areas around the Chesapeake and coastal bays. That is a great forum and a great vehicle for increased climate adaptation and resiliency. And our framework embraces that and puts a priority on equity, because underserved and overburdened communities are at great risk from flooding and heat waves and other stressors that we know are coming and have been coming. Over the last decade, Maryland has seen 31 extreme events, $10 billion in damages from hurricanes and flooding. We're very focused on that. And we're also developing what I hope will become a model for other states, not just within the U.S. Climate Alliance, the 25 forward-leaning states on climate, but also throughout the country, developing a scorecard so that every year an academic institution and advocates and policymakers in government can track how are we doing on metrics. I've been kidding with Anu that as our state developed a greenhouse gas reduction plan to get to over 50% reduction by 2030, we're also coupling it with an adaptation and resiliency plan. And the joke is, although somewhat serious too, that we're striving to be half as dirty by 2030 and also twice as sturdy. So the scorecard for resiliency is tracking actions and metrics to increase the resiliency, the sturdiness of infrastructure. We're very focused on the $47 billion as in the bipartisan infrastructure plan for climate resiliency. And we're also focused on learning from other states, our state colleagues who are leaning forward on adaptation and resiliency. So it's an honor to be part of the panel, and I'll turn it back to you, Anu.
Thank you, Ben. What was it? Twice as dirty, half as sturdy?
No. Twice as dirty.
Okay. All right.
Half as dirty and twice as sturdy by 2030.
All right. I figured, thank you. I figured I'd gotten it wrong somehow. That's really fascinating. And I think we all face some of these issues of, I don't want to say community involvement. It really is community led, and then maybe governments as first followers, which is what Governor Ige said the other day. And I was like, yeah, I think that really is true. So how do we pull that together? So I know you're not going to be around for the whole panel, but maybe we can squeeze in some questions as we get a couple other people to speak first. I also wanted to thank my colleagues who are back at home and on the screen. Hi, guys. So it's so nice that, I've not been able to, obviously, I wouldn't have been able to put this together all by myself. This happened within a few hours where, we just, eight of us just put all these things together, and it was amazing, the energy behind it. So you see the four people behind me? Three? Okay. All right. Sorry, I keep losing all these. Yeah. Okay. So what I was hoping to do is pass it off to Minnesota at this point. Frank is on there?
Yeah.
Okay. So pass it on to Minnesota. Frank Kolash, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Climate Director, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, who is on the ground at home. So meaning, I don't know if you're actually in your house, but anyway, like at home on the ground in the United States. All right. So Frank, I'm going to pass it on to you if you would like to address what you're doing in the next little bit here, or anything else really. It's sort of a work call, right? So tell us what you're doing.
That's very good. Well, thank you for the opportunity, and welcome from Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. I needed to toss that in there with Secretary Grumbles bragging about all of the water importance for Maryland. Certainly is very important for Minnesota and the start of the Great Lakes and Lake Superior here. So I am standing in for our now Commissioner, Katrina Kessler, who in her previous role as Assistant Commissioner for Water and Agricultural Policy in Minnesota, just recently was named as our Commissioner for the Pollution Control Agency. And Katrina's not available today, so I will pinch hit. Go through a couple of items here. It will sound very similar to what Secretary Grumbles covered and highlighting particularly what we're focused on in the next few years here and a few months is building our climate action framework, which includes a resiliency and adaptation section in it, and looking at also how we can sell the ways for Minnesotans to see climate resiliency and climate adaptation being part of co-benefits for Minnesota, solving the climate risks that are going to come to Minnesota from a warmer and wetter climate, where we've seen significant temperature increases, particularly in the northern part of Minnesota. We've seen more precipitation happen in Minnesota. Excuse me. We have seen more heavy rainfall and storms and storm damage and flooding in Minnesota, and how that impacts our natural lands, our working lands, our communities, and the services that they must provide to Minnesotans. One of the areas that we focus on in particular, because of the executive order that was signed by Governor Tim Walz in 2019, is the engagement of our tribal nations in Minnesota, and particularly finding out what assistance and what information they need to continue their work, and what are the principles and values that they believe that the state of Minnesota should be coming to the table with in looking at climate resiliency and adaptation going forward. And what they've identified for us in our previous meetings has been able to seek those meaningful tools. And this applies not just to our tribal nations, but this is what we're also hearing from our communities about the information and the meaningful tools to be able to make smart decisions based on the changing climate going forward. Our tribal nations have also identified the need for technical expertise and the need for financing. And those are similar themes that we're hearing from our cities. And reading through the Green Steps Cities example in the playbook, that those are the kinds of activities and excitement that we hear from cities, but the needs that we're hearing in particular from them about what role the state can play. So also falling in line with the letting the local governments lead and focus, and having the state be part of the support system with the data, the expertise, and identifying the funding mechanisms. We also have a strong commitment with equity for our climate resiliency work, and that includes the continual learning that we have from Minnesota's tribal nations. In particular, what we're learning from them is the need to incorporate the traditional ecological knowledge that they have about Minnesota and the landscapes here. We also know that we need to provide more information and more time to some of the communities who are on the front lines and disproportionately impacted by changing climate, those who are less likely or less able to respond to and adapt to a changing climate. And then also make sure that we're providing the information to our communities and to Minnesotans so they can make the smart decisions about how we can respond to and adapt to a changing climate in Minnesota. In the very near term, we just released a climate resiliency grant program targeted at local governments throughout Minnesota with a focus on doing an assessment for vulnerabilities and planning around stormwater resilience, wastewater resilience, and then community resilience for those services and public infrastructures that are most likely to be impacted by a warming climate in Minnesota, by a warmer, wetter, and heavier rainfall storms in Minnesota. All good local government units and tribal governments are eligible for this, and this includes our cities, our counties, our tribal nations, townships, water conservation districts, water management organizations, and our regional development commissions and our regional governments. And in a unique part that we've added to try to make these available as possible to communities that meet the equity threshold, but also greater Minnesota, is to have only a 10% match for these grants so that they're more accessible for these communities. And then ideally what we want to build is the vulnerability assessments funding and technical assistance from the state that then lead in to the next actions that the state is looking at. And that is focused on how can we provide the bonding and state funding to actually move forward with these plans and get these projects in the ground that builds the resiliency, builds the adaptation, protects Minnesotans, and also can look for those co-benefits of protecting water quality or storing carbon or protecting our landscapes and working with our natural and working lands team to identify those codependencies and those areas where we can get equal action. So with that, I think I will stop my comment, make sure that we have plenty of time for our other panelists and be willing to answer any questions when we get to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Frank. That was really interesting. I think, yeah, we'll maybe save the questions till the last. But I'd like to give everyone a chance to speak. I also quickly wanted to say, though, that I wanted to thank the Climate Registry for putting this whole thing together and bring all of us together in this format. So the space has been wonderful to have. Those of you back at home, though, I mean, you're not missing anything in terms of weather. Sorry if Glaswegians that are helping me. Next, I'd like to hand the mic over to Brian Ambrett from Maine, Senior Climate Resilience Coordinator, Maine Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future. Over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Anu, and good evening, everyone. Good afternoon if you're in the States. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. It's a really exciting time for Maine. We are about 3 weeks short of our 1-year anniversary for our climate action plan that was released last December. And this is an effort by Governor Janet Mills and her Maine Climate Council to develop a plan to meet Maine's ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals and also goals for community resilience, infrastructure resilience, and economic resilience across the state. And all of those are really sort of front and center right now as we emerge from the pandemic and think about how we build back better in Maine. So we're getting really close to the anniversary and telling the story of 1 year of implementation of the state's climate action plan. And there's a lot to report on the resilience side. So I'll just pick up a couple of examples here. One of the early wins was getting a bill through the legislature that established sea level rise projections for the state agencies in Maine to begin planning and developing how they're going to run their operations and permitting and rules and programs according to official science-based sea level rise projections. And that is enabling a suite of other activities now that those projections are in place. For starters, we're going to shortly be commissioning a sea level rise modeling exercise that will take those projections, apply them out over the next 50 and 80 years, and then be able to drill down to very specific places along the coast with not just sea level rise modeling, but storm surge modeling, wave run up. And that will enable us to do a coast-wide vulnerability assessment, looking at infrastructure, waterfront infrastructure, critical infrastructure, to give us a sense where we need to start investing in infrastructure resilience. And then we'll lead to some programming around community resilience building and capacity building for the planning that we know needs to happen in our communities, not just along the coast, but statewide. So we'll have tools like that sea level rise model and other flood risk reduction tools for our inland communities to start thinking about community resilience and what that means for communities to both integrate mitigation, carbon reduction into their planning as well as resiliency efforts. And so moving forward, we anticipate in the next 6 to 12 months launching 2 really important programs. One will be a grants and capacity building program for municipalities that will supply funding and the technical assistance to do resilience building in Maine small towns. And then an infrastructure adaptation fund, which will help communities and regions across the state think about their most vulnerable infrastructure, how to build that infrastructure so that it's more resilient to the conditions that we're seeing today, but also takes into account the conditions that are likely to be seen during the lifetime of that project, whether it's 25 years now or 75 years from now. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion and hand it back to you, Anu. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Brian. I was just exchanging some texts with Jen Phillips, who is with the U.S. Climate Alliance and back at home and behind the scenes has been instrumental in pulling this together. And I said, it feels a bit awkward sitting here because we can't see you guys. And she said, it looks kind of cool from home. So that makes me feel better. So anyway, here we are. Last of the M states in this lineup is Massachusetts. And Katie and I just exchanged glances when Brian was talking about this, about municipalities and so on, because of course, Massachusetts has its wonderful program, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. But I'll let Kathleen Theoharides, Secretary, Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, talk about this.
Thank you so much, Anu, and a big thanks to the U.S. Climate Alliance and the Climate Registry. I think one of the great things that the Alliance does is bring together solutions that can be implemented across state lines and outside of the country, in fact, and best practices from states. I thought I'd talk about one program in particular, our Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which is a state and local partnership. It is profiled in that Resiliency book from the Climate Alliance, but it grew out of an executive order signed by Governor Baker in 2016 that outlined a whole of government approach to climate resiliency. So this was not just a challenge for the Energy and Environmental Secretariat or our agencies, it was a challenge that we had to look at across housing and economic development, across public health, and across all of the different branches of state government. The first piece of that was completing a state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan, combining the federally required FEMA plan with a forward look. It's always taken a historical look, but really looking at the data to understand what was going to change in terms of our climate. It is a very much water everywhere situation, like many of our sister states in the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic and Minnesota. But one of the first things we saw was that we had a number of communities who were already beginning the work of planning for climate change and understanding their vulnerabilities. And we wanted to give the rest of our 351 cities and towns the tools they needed to understand their risks, to draw from their strengths, and then to prioritize their actions as they move forward. And so I'm a planner by training, but I also know that a lot of planning sits on shelves. And so we really wanted to create an active framework that wouldn't plan to death and would move forward very quickly. So we worked with the Nature Conservancy and a couple of other nonprofit partners to develop an 8-hour planning module where cities and towns worked with state experts, with folks who had been trained to facilitate these sessions, and then they had to bring in all of these partners and stakeholders from their community. That effort resulted in a list of vulnerabilities and strengths, and strength is an important, often forgot part here. What can you build on to really accelerate your progress and understand how your community can move forward? to put together a plan of key actions. And we followed on this grant opportunity with an infrastructure fund, our MVP Action Grant program. And so once communities had gone through this planning process, they then gained access to significant funding for infrastructure. An important tenet of this program overall was the engagement and involvement of environmental justice communities within municipalities, and then prioritize funding for equitable solutions. And so that's been a driving force in all of this. But this started in 2017 as a $500,000 grant program. We weren't sure how it would be received. We now have 95% of our communities in the state enrolled, and we've spent about $65 million. We're trying to put more of our American Rescue Plan dollars towards the infrastructure investments we need to make, and are excited equally about the infrastructure bill that Congress just passed as a funding source. Something that's really become critical, though, coming out of all of this planning and municipal partnership, is the need for updated standards, design standards, permitting standards, building codes, things of this nature that reflect not the historic conditions that we've built for in the past, but the changing conditions that we're seeing. And so we have created this new tool called the Resilient Massachusetts Design Standard tool. And what this does is updates the standards in a variety of different spaces to incorporate new rainfall data, new coastal data in terms of sea level rise, new heat information, and a variety of other factors. And we're piloting it initially as something that proponents have to go through in our Massachusetts Environmental Protection Act permitting, and also through grant applications across state government. And one of the key pieces there is putting it into our statewide capital planning framework, so that any investment the state is making in any sector actually has to be a resilient investment for the future. A key thing, more to come on that, but I just wanted to say how grateful I've been for the opportunity to exchange ideas with colleagues throughout this process, and for the Alliance's leadership on not just climate mitigation, but also incorporating adaptation into this story.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, water everywhere. We in Hawaii, we do know about that, but it is actually getting inland as well. And that's one of the things we've been trying to work with on vulnerabilities and floodwaters and so on. So I like to say it's water from the sky, water from the ocean, and water from the land. So it's just coming in from everywhere for us as well. So with that, that's the end of the M states, and we're going to go alphabetically to North Carolina. And I should say that I've been very admiring of North Carolina's adaptation plan, and have actually, well, I haven't read it cover to cover because it's like 300 some pages, I think, but I did look at a lot of it, and it helped us. It sort of provided a model for a much slimmer volume for us, just as a beginning for a resilience paper in Hawaii, which again, Jen Phillips helped me with, and we had about 30 people involved in the writing of it. So, you know, we've got a good sort of collaborative start. So with that, I'm going to give you Amanda Martin, Chief Resilience Officer, North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. Over to you, Amanda.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. And thank you to all of the panel organizers as well. It's really great to be able to share our stories and share the things that we are working on in this kind of a format. So North Carolina we're a coastal state. We're in the southeastern United States. And like many of the other states that we've heard from, the primary climate hazard that we worry about is flooding. We have a significant coastline and a lot of assets along that coastline. And it's quite vulnerable to hurricanes. But we also have significant inland riverine flooding. We have a coastal plain that's very flat. We have a lot of development in the middle part of the state. And what we find is that the storm systems that come slowly and park over our state tend to collect water that just slowly drains through the watershed into our low-lying communities, where they have flooding sometime days up to a week after the storms actually left, so over sunny skies. And frankly, flooding's not the only risk that we have. We have a high heat risk, significant public health impacts of heat that we think about, a lot of outdoor industries, a lot of agriculture and recreation industries where workers are at risk. And we have housing types that don't necessarily protect the residents. We have a lot of mobile homes in our state. It's a significant share of our overall housing stock, and it's a really significant share of the overall housing stock, which is affordable to low-income households. So all of these combine to paint a little bit of a picture of our climate vulnerability in North Carolina. Our state has been working on a number of fronts in recent years to adapt to climate change. And I think that while sometimes we in North Carolina have an image of a place that has had some high visibility politics over sea level rise standards or projections, there's actually, if you look a little closer, some surprising consensus on the need to address our changing climate and address our vulnerability to the changing climate, because it's been so real, so personally real to residents of our state, because we've just had so many devastating floods in the last 5 years or so. In 2018, Governor Cooper issued Executive Order 80, which called on, it was our North Carolina's commitment to address climate change. It discussed both mitigation and adaptation. And it called on state, I'm going to speak on the adaptation side of things, it called on state agencies to examine the impact of climate change on their operations and to take actions to become more resilient. And also in this executive order, it called for the state to issue its first climate vulnerability assessment and climate resilience plan, which Anu talked about. And this was a really fantastic, and now it serves as our compass, particularly for my role as Chief Resilience Officer, but it also process-wise really brought together quite a few state agencies to better collaborate and discuss resilience, and we've been able to hold up those relationships through an ongoing kind of task force, interagency task force on resilience. And so it was both the product, but also the process that was really impactful for North Carolina. In 2019, the governor created the position of Chief Resilience Officer. We have a 3-person team and 1 person who's grant funded. And while that's a small team, it is so incredibly important to have staff capacity, and we're constantly working on demonstrating that value, because I think that sometimes we can overlook the necessity to have staff working on these issues and think more about the major investments that we need to make in infrastructure and communities. But in North Carolina in particular, we have one of the challenges that we face with climate resilience is that a lot of our local governments are completely at capacity, especially in our most vulnerable areas, which tend to be rural. You might have one person who is the town clerk and the fire captain and the floodplain manager. And they also actually play that role in 2 other towns. So really we have very limited local capacity. And so this question of capacity just comes up over and over and over in many contexts. So like other states that we've heard about today, we've also been working to provide technical assistance to local communities to do their own climate resilience planning and their own assessments. And this has largely to date been in our coastal zone and led by our coastal program. And my office is working to bring that model inland into some of these places where they really don't have a staff person, they don't have a staff planner that would take on this kind of work. And so what we're proposing is a regional model of this kind of a program where we're pulling together multi-county regions to do climate resilience planning. So to do vulnerability assessment and to craft a plan, or we're really calling it something a little narrower than a plan, to be realistic, more of a portfolio of projects. And this is something we'll absolutely be working on the next 6 to 12 months, something that I've consulted with many of the other panelists about setting up our program. what's unique about what we're doing is there's a few aspects. I mean, really, it's the regional component. We see that from a capacity standpoint, the solutions need to be regional, but also just from a climate impacts perspective. We can't have each community or even each county be its own island solving its own problems. We have to work together, particularly when we look at the watershed scale because of the nature of the watershed type flooding that we have in North Carolina. And we're hoping that this program, by bringing together regions to create these products, we have a really heavy emphasis on stakeholder engagement and relationship building, because we hope it'll be the foundation for further action. And we have a tiny bit of implementation money that we hope will seed further work in these regional relationships on the topic of resilience. We also, I wanted to mention, have a focus on equity in climate resilience, and we still have a long way to go on that front. North Carolina, we think of ourselves as home to the modern environmental justice movement, certainly using that language, environmental racism, which means we have a long legacy of civic capacity, which is fantastic, but also a lot of legacies left of entrenched racial disparities. We have a chapter in our climate plan just focused on climate equity, which was a really fantastic fantastic activity for the state to undertake, to kind of lay some of that groundwork and talk about what are the sources of these disparities. You know, is it about exposure to climate hazards, or is it about the context of disparate levels of adaptive capacity, and where are those issues? Kind of getting a little more specific about what we're talking about. And the ways that our programs that promote resilience may inadvertently play into some of those existing disparities. So, for example, a lot of our, you know, in general, I would say homeowner recovery programs are programs that help property owners recover, rebuild, weatherize, tend to favor homeowners, so not landlords, in other words, which leaves out our renters. So kind of trying to name these issues and figure out what how the state can address some of them. So again, we see the issue in North Carolina, and we've done some work on it, and there's a lot of work left to go. I think one last piece I will say briefly before handing it over is that there's some really interesting work in North Carolina around relocation. I think the conversation about managed retreat in the United States has tended to focus on coastal areas where it's absolutely needed. The conversation certainly, and managed retreat in some places. But what we're seeing in North Carolina is that conversation is obviously very fraught. It's very fraught. And what I think sometimes gets missed is the fact that retreat's actually happening. It's just happening in these vulnerable inland communities that are getting flooded, that already are economically depressed. And so in places where climate vulnerability and economic distress are intersecting, we're having net out migration. You can look at our new census data. We also do have buyout programs that are helping those who want to move out to have means to do so. But I think that that's an open conversation in our state about kind of what are we working on with respect to our strategy for relocation. So let me conclude it there and give it back to Ani.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. You know, just really crucial issues that we're all dealing with, especially of capacity for small states or even large states, just because we have so much work left to do, and it takes so long to do it if you're in state government. So, and of course, the issue of managed retreat. So, you know, right on there with your points about how it affects the people who are already so vulnerable. So just as you were getting comfortable, all of you thinking we're going in alphabetical order, I'm going to shake it up a little. And we're going to go up to Colorado, where I have Ann Miller, who is Colorado Resiliency Officer Director, Department of Local Affairs. So no coastline there, but I think we've got some other issues. So you want to take it away from here, Ann?
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for giving me the opportunity to again meet with my colleagues here. And as all of those that have gone before have described water as a major opportunity and challenge, we have the lack of water, with the drought being a major challenge in the West, as well as fueling increased wildfires. We had 2 of our worst on record last year. And of course, flooding, and often the flooding will follow fire. So different challenges and some great work that is happening to start to tackle some of these here in Colorado. So our office, which was initially established in 2013 after some historic floods here, has grown into kind of a holistic resiliency coordination hub for the state. And we take a systems approach and work across agencies and with our local government partners. So I'm going to highlight a couple of things that we're doing in Colorado. So under Governor Jared Polis, the office just last year updated the Colorado Resiliency Framework. It was a first of its kind in 2015, and we've kind of broadened out the focus. So this framework identifies our state's resiliency vision, identifies 6 priority strategies, and explores risk and vulnerabilities across 4 different themes: adapting to climate change, of course, understanding risks from natural and other hazards, addressing social inequities and those unique community needs, often in our rural communities that are different, and pursuing economic diversity and vibrancy. We have a Colorado Resiliency Working Group, and that is made up of state agencies and partners. We meet quarterly and work to implement these priority strategies and track progress and collaborate on resiliency issues. Some highlights of the work together this past year include a major initiative, and Amanda, your discussions about kind of the regional planning, it kind of is echoed here with this project, where it is the largest statewide planning effort in rural Colorado that any of us can remember. We're working with 16 regional teams in rural Colorado to develop action plans to address economic and community impacts of the pandemic and reduce risks to future disruptions, including climate change. Another highlight from our Department of Ag, it was a passage of a state bill to create an agricultural drought and climate resilience office there. Our natural and working lands group is doing some strategic planning and mapping to identify where investments in wildfire mitigation is most needed. And then the last highlight is the newly created Colorado Climate Corps that will place 240 AmeriCorps members throughout the state to help mitigate the threat of future wildfires and floods, improve health and resiliency of public lands, and provide resources and education to marginalized communities. In order to track our progress toward resilient outcomes, the Colorado Resiliency Framework has guided the design of some community level as well as state level indicators that we're sharing on dashboards and data visualization of these metrics on our website, coresiliency.com. The state has also developed a future avoided cost explorer. It's an interactive online resource to guide local resiliency planning and actions to reduce risk to floods, wildfires, and drought. In addition, our Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment is building a dashboard to track metrics on another plan, which is our greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap that was also released last year. And it includes a data viewer showing disproportionately impacted communities. Finally, this year we completed an update of our online Colorado Resiliency Resource Center, that coresiliency.com I mentioned. It's got the dashboard, case studies, we've got resilience and post-disaster recovery toolkits meant to be guides for local governments, kind of step-by-step. This site also offers a lot of events. We did a whole climate webinar series, and we have an upcoming resiliency summit in January. Finally, we've got a local government peer exchange platform to share information and lessons learned. We have a wildfire peer exchange going on, as well as COVID recovery. I'll end with just a couple priorities and challenges. So I really do believe a big focus for our office, we got grant funding, we doubled our staff, grant funded through the Economic Development Administration for this roadmaps planning initiative I mentioned earlier. So we're going to be really helping these rural communities think creatively about the future and leveraging historic stimulus dollars for transformational projects with co-benefits. So a lot of that's focused on economic development, but it's really very holistic as well. They're identifying affordable housing as a big challenge as well. You know, we continue to work toward building that culture of resilience in state and local government. And we're finding that, you know, we really do need to continue to push on that strategic planning and developing the organizational structures and staff capacity, like I've heard mentioned, to continue this work. We're not there yet. Some things that we're thinking about here that we are inspired by our other state agencies and states across with cool programs around building the resiliency and sustainability program, the New York Climate Smart Communities, the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Program all offer inspiration. So we're looking at how we can scheme something like that in Colorado as well. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Congratulations on the Climate Corps. I'll be very excited to see how that rolls out for you guys. I think Hawaii is also experimenting a little bit with that, and I'd love to exchange notes. So thank you. And also on the dashboard, your toolkits and resiliency framework. So I'll be calling you. Our last in-person and panel speaker is New York. We've got Basil Sagos, Commissioner of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Over to you, Basil.
Great. Anu, thank you. And let me echo everyone's thanks to the Climate Alliance and the registry for just putting on a fantastic show today, but of course, all the help that they've given us over the years as multi-state actors trying to do right for the environment, for climate. I think, you know, New York, again, like many states, water-rich state, 2012, shortly after I started with the state, Superstorm Sandy floods all of downstate and water is pouring into the World Trade Center pit. And that was a bit of a paradigm shift in New York, where the issue of climate and water took on less of a political tone and more of an urgency than perhaps existed beforehand. That is characterized, that event in a way characterized a lot of the early work that we started doing in New York under the prior governor and now under the current governor, Governor Hochul, merging really good policies with funding to match that urgency, because we knew we had to communicate immediately to the public. The public began to see this, they began to ask for results, and you know, planning is crucially important. All the work that we've put into planning over the years is crucially important, so we know where the problems are. But if we're not turning projects around quickly enough, then that puts us in more of a reactive mode. So we were very much set on this sort of no regrets approach to investing in the landscape in New York. So we have wonderful laws. We have one of the strongest climate laws in the country, CLCPA, terrible acronym, but a very good law, which has as its heart moving the entire economy net zero, but also requiring us to effectively map the state, in particular disadvantaged communities. So we looking at various metrics right now, putting a definition together. Where are such things as floods impacting disadvantaged communities? So we know how to turn around this 40% of investments, like the Biden administration's goal. We have a 40% goal as well. All of those investments then can go into the areas that are most impacted by problems. We work very closely with the Army Corps in New York. I'm sure like many of the states involved here, we have about $3.5 billion of work after Superstorm Sandy just on coastal resilience, which embraced the idea of strategic retreat and wetlands and creating green infrastructure. We created a Clean Water Infrastructure Act, which is now about $4.5 billion of money going into grant money, matching up with about $1 billion a year of loan money to fix our water problems. And as we all know, the waters, sewage and wastewater are part of resiliency. So we knew we needed to get money into the hands of the community leaders and ultimately push projects out. Again, these no regrets projects. Like other states, we also mapped very closely sea level rise. We put in place a new law on sea level rise in New York, which is helping to guide us downstate. Upstate, of course, is a much thornier. When I talk about upstate New York, that's really the non-tidal portion of the state, which is quite big. All the streams, the rivers, and of course 2 major Great Lakes, which have been flooding in recent years. So we're of course increasing our ability to understand where the floodwaters are, where the high water level is, and where the low water level is, which presents problems to us on drinking water intakes, for example. And again, matching that up with money, multi-year initiative on the Great Lakes, $300 million to again, invest in a more resilient waterfront. So I'll echo everyone's comments, and really I think we share many of the same kinds of programs. But I wanted to emphasize that results for us has been really, really important. Communicating and of course I think which is a big theme of the COP is accountability and engagement. And subsequent to signing this climate law that we have now, we've really gone the extra mile to increase the diversity of voices and communities that are actually affecting policy. They're helping to define what the impacts are. They're helping to define what the solutions are going to be. To sustain the state over 40 or 50 years, we need that. We need those voices. We need the communities to be at the table with us. So just in broad strokes, that's our approach to resiliency in New York. Lots of great programs. Thank you, Colorado, for recognizing Climate Smart Communities, which is a fantastic program in New York, and a tool with which we can help to get funding out. But really pleased to be with you all and to learn so many incredible stories today.
Thank you so much, Basil. We are just 2 minutes shy of the hour, so not a whole lot of questions that we can field, but I just wanted to summarize this with just reading off 5 points from the governor's climate resilience playbook that the U.S. Climate Alliance just released. And basically talks about climate resilience action grows slowly over time, centers equity in its leadership processes and investment strategies, is embedded in strong partnerships and relationships, breaks down silos, is built through innovative funding and finance strategies. There's a lot more to it, but that's the summary. And I thought I would encourage people to look at it, to read it. And I know I'm going to be looking at it for Hawaii. I thought we did a pretty good job, everyone here. Thank you, everyone back at home. Once we are done with all our hoop jumping and COVID protocols and stuff, we will be back home talking more about this with you. For those of us who were here, those of you who were here watching and listening in, thank you so much for coming. We can be found through the U.S. Climate Alliance's website, usclimatealliance.org. So that's what nitty gritty looks like. And if you really want to be nitty gritty, you can come find some beach in Hawaii. All right. Aloha, everyone. Mahalo.